The vintage aircraft sat silent in Marcus Reed's driveway until HOA President Karen Whitfield had it towed as junk. But what she didn't know was that Marcus was a retired federal aviation investigator, and that junk plane contained classified evidence from a decades-old case. Now, as federal agents surround Karen's pristine suburban home, she's about to discover that some neighbors fight back with the full weight of the United States government. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Estates as Marcus Reed stepped onto his driveway, coffee mug in hand, expecting to see his beloved 1952 Cessna 170 gleaming in the early light. Instead, he found nothing but tire marks on the asphalt and a yellow citation fluttering in the breeze like a surrender flag. His weathered hands trembled as he picked up the notice, his 30-year career with the Federal Aviation Administration, having taught him to read bureaucratic language with surgical precision. But this wasn't federal paperwork. This was homeowner association vindictiveness dressed up in legal terminology. Violation notice: abandoned vehicle or junk removal. Property: 847 Maple Lane. Violation: storage of non-operational aircraft in residential. Driveway: vehicle towed by authority of HOA Board Resolution 2024-47. The signature at the bottom made his blood pressure spike. Karen Whitfield, HOA President. Marcus had known this day would come. For 3 months, ever since he'd moved the Cessna from the hangar to his driveway for restoration work, Karen had been circling like a vulture. First came the passive-aggressive notes tucked under his windshield wipers. Then the formal complaints, filed with the city. Finally, heated confrontations at HOA meetings where she'd stand at the podium, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing the air as she ranted about property values and community standards. What Karen didn't know, what nobody in Willowbrook Estates knew, was that Marcus's restoration project wasn't just a hobby. The Cessna wasn't just any vintage aircraft. It was evidence. Federal evidence that had been sitting in a government warehouse for 23 years until Marcus finally received permission to purchase it after his retirement. The plane had been seized in 2001 during Operation Skywatch, a joint DAFAA investigation into drug smuggling routes through the Southwest. Marcus had been the lead investigator, and this particular Cessna had belonged to a pilot named Tommy Vasquez, who disappeared just hours before a massive federal raid. The plane had been clean when they'd seized it, but Marcus had always suspected. There was more to the story. The case had gone cold, but Marcus never forgot. Now, at 62, with government pension padding his bank account and time finally on his side, he'd bought the Cessna with plans to restore it and maybe, just maybe, solve a puzzle that had haunted him for over 2 decades. His phone buzzed. A text from his neighbor, Ed Kowalski, saw the tow truck this morning. Sorry, man. Karen's lost her damn mind. Marcus's jaw clenched. He'd tried reasoning with Karen, had even shown her the proper registration documents proving the aircraft was legally owned and insured. But Karen Whitfield wasn't interested in reason. She was interested in control, in wielding the HOA rulebook like a weapon against anyone who didn't conform to her vision of suburban perfection. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Here was a woman who'd never worked a day in law enforcement, never understood the weight of federal authority, treating a retired federal investigator like some common rule breaker. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed the number from a citation. Kowalski's towing answered on the 3rd ring. Yeah, this is Marcus Reed. You towed my aircraft this morning. Oh, yeah, the plane guy. That was a weird one. Don't get many aircraft calls. Where is it now? Impound lot off Highway 9. But listen, mister, I'm gonna be straight with you. That HOA lady, she was real specific about the towing fee. Said the plane's been sitting there for months, called it abandoned property. My fee's gonna be $800 for the tow, plus $50 a day storage. Marcus felt the familiar burn of injustice in his chest. The plane wasn't abandoned. It's registered, insured, and I've been actively working on it. Hey, I'm just the tow guy. You gotta take that up with the lady who called us. After hanging up, Marcus stood in his empty driveway, feeling the weight of decades of federal service behind him. He'd spent 30 years investigating aviation crimes, tracking down smugglers and fraudsters who thought they could outsmart the system. He'd testified before Congress, briefed senators, and sent dozens of criminals to federal prison. Karen Whitfield had just made the biggest mistake of her perfectly organized life. Marcus walked back into his house, past the frame commendations and photographs of aircraft seizures, past the bookshelf lined with federal aviation regulations and criminal procedure manuals, and into his home office. His computer screen flickered to life, displaying the desktop that still bore his old FAA credentials. He opened his contact list, not the civilian one, but the other one. The list that contained direct phone numbers for federal prosecutors, FBI aviation specialists, and DEA agents who owed him favors from cases that had made their careers. But first, he pulled out a thick manila folder labeled Operation Skywatch, Vasquez, Thomas, case status, inactive. Inside were photographs of the seized Cessna, maintenance records, flight logs, and witness statements that painted a picture of a drug smuggling operation that had moved millions of dollars worth of narcotics through American airspace. The case had never been officially closed, merely suspended pending new evidence. Tommy Vasquez had vanished, but his plane had told a story. Hidden compartments, modified fuel systems, and wear patterns that suggested regular flights along known smuggling routes. Marcus had been days away from a breakthrough when other cases pulled him away, and by the time he'd returned to the Vasquez file, the trail had gone cold. Now, thanks to Karen's authoritarian overreach, that evidence was sitting in a civilian impound lot, exposed to the elements and potential tampering. Marcus reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 2 years. Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Aviation Division. Sarah, it's Marcus Reed. Marcus, good to hear from you. How's retirement treating you? Could be better. I need a favor, and it's time sensitive. What's going on? Marcus explained the situation, watching. Sarah's responses shift from casual interest to professional concern as he detailed the Cessna's history and current predicament. Wait, Sarah interrupted. You're telling me that evidence from Operation Skywatch is now in civilian hands due to an HOA dispute? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Marcus, that's a federal crime. Interference with evidence, obstruction of justice. We could make a dozen charges stick. Even if the case is inactive, that aircraft is still technically federal evidence. No. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Sarah's voice hardened with the tone Marcus remembered from their days working complex cases together. I'm going to make some phone calls. Don't do anything until you hear from me. After hanging up, Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. Karen Whitfield thought she was dealing with some retired old man who collected vintage airplanes. She had no idea she'd just interfered with a federal investigation. His phone rang 20 minutes later. Sarah Chen, calling back with news that made Marcus's day significantly brighter. I spoke with AUSA Patricia Gonzalez. She remembers the Vasquez case and is very interested in why evidence from a federal drug investigation is now sitting in a civilian tow lot. She's issuing a federal seizure warrant as we speak. What about the HOA? What about them? They knowingly removed evidence from a federal investigation. The fact that they didn't know it was evidence isn't going to matter much to a federal prosecutor. Marcus looked out his window toward Karen Whitfield's house, where her pristine white Mercedes sat in a driveway that had never been marred by anything more controversial than a Christmas wreath that stayed up past New Year's. Her house was a monument to suburban conformity, beige stucco, manicured lawn, and flower beds arranged with mathematical precision. Sarah, I want to be there when you serve the warrant. I figured you would. Meet us at the tow lot at 3 p.m. And Marcus. Yeah. This is going to get ugly. When the feds start digging into HOA business practices, they tend to find all sorts of interesting things. At exactly 3:17 p.m., a convoy of federal vehicles rolled into Kowalski's towing. 3 black SUVs, an FBI evidence van, and a U.S. Attorney sedan created an impressive display of federal authority in the dusty lot filled with repossessed cars and abandoned motorcycles. Marcus watched from the passenger seat of Sarah Chen's SUV as a dozen federal agents spread out across the lot, their movements precise and coordinated. This wasn't just evidence recovery. This was a statement. Agent Chen approached the office where Billy Kowalski stood gaping at the federal parade outside his window. Mr. Kowalski? I'm Agent Chen, FBI. We're here to recover federal evidence that was improperly removed from an active investigation. Billy's face went pale. Look, I just tow cars. The HOA lady called, said it was abandoned property. I got the paperwork right here. We'll need copies of everything, including your communications with the Homeowner Association. As agents photographed and documented the Cessna, Marcus walked around his aircraft with the careful eye of someone who knew every rivet and wire. What he found made his blood run cold. "Sarah, you need to see this." She approached. The morning mist hadn't yet lifted from Willowbrook Estates when the first federal vehicle turned onto Maple Lane. Karen Whitfield stood at her kitchen window, nursing her third cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint her manicured neighborhood. In golden hues, blissfully unaware that her world was about to implode, at 6:47 a.m., her doorbell rang. Karen glanced at the clock, frowning. Who could be visiting at such an ungodly hour? Through her peephole, she saw two figures in dark suits standing on her porch, their posture unmistakably official. She opened the door with the confident smile she'd perfected during years of HOA meetings and charity luncheons. "Good morning. Can I help you?" The woman stepped forward, her badge gleaming in the morning light. "Mrs. Whitfield?" "Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. This is Agent Michael Torres. We have a federal search warrant for your residence and all HOA records in your possession." Karen's smile evaporated. "I'm sorry, what?" Agent Chen extended a folded document. "Federal search warrant. We are investigating potential obstruction of justice and interference with federal evidence." "This is ridiculous," Karen sputtered, her voice climbing an octave. "I run a homeowner association, not a criminal enterprise." "May we come in?" Karen's hand shook as she unfolded the warrant, scanning legal language that might as well have been written in Sanskrit. Her eyes caught phrases like knowing interference with federal investigation and conspiracy to obstruct justice, words that made her perfectly ordered world tilt sideways. "I don't understand. This is about Marcus Reed's airplane." "Among other things, yes'm." Agent Torres spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to compliance. "Mrs. Whitfield, we have agents positioned around your home. We are going to conduct this search whether you cooperate or not. Your choice is whether this goes smoothly or becomes a neighborhood spectacle." As if summoned by his words, Karen glimpsed black SUVs parked strategically around the cul-de-sac, federal agents in tactical vests beginning to emerge. Her neighbor Doris Pemberton stood in her bathrobe on her front porch, cell phone already recording. "Fine," Karen whispered. "Come in." The next 3 hours transformed Karen's pristine home into a federal crime scene. Agents methodically searched. Through her home office, photographing HOA documents, copying hard drives, and bagging evidence with the mechanical precision of people who'd done this thousands of times, Karen sat in her living room under Agent Torres's watchful eye, listening to strangers rifle through her life. Every few minutes, an agent would appear with a question. "We need the password for your laptop. We found these communication records with Kowalski Towing. Can you explain these payments? There's a safe in your bedroom closet. We'll need." That opened. By 10 a.m., Agent Chen had established a command post in Karen's dining room, HOA files spread across her antique mahogany table like evidence in a murder trial. The irony wasn't lost on Karen. The same table where she'd hosted countless HOA board meetings was now being used to build a federal case against her. "Mrs. Whitfield," Agent Chen called. "Could you join me, please?" Karen walked into her own dining room feeling like a stranger in her own home. Agent Chen sat surrounded by file boxes, legal pads covered with notes, and her laptop displaying what appeared to be financial records. "Let's talk about your HOA's enforcement procedures." "I follow the covenants and bylaws to the letter." "I'm sure you do, but I'm curious about this pattern we are seeing." Agent Chen turned the laptop screen toward Karen. "Over the past 2 years, your HOA has filed 47 violations, initiated 32 liens, and authorized 19 property seizures. That's an unusually high enforcement rate for a community this size." Karen felt defensive anger flare in her chest. "We maintain high standards. Property values depend on..." "Mrs. Whitfield, I spent the morning reviewing comparable HOA data. The national average for communities like yours is about 6 enforcement actions per year. You're averaging 2 per month. So what? We are thorough." Agent Chen's expression remained neutral, but her tone sharpened. "Let's talk about being thorough. Yesterday, you authorized the removal of what you believe to be an abandoned aircraft from Mr. Reed's property, correct?" "Yes. It violated our covenants regarding..." "Did you verify ownership of the aircraft?" "It was obviously abandoned. It had been sitting there for months." "Did you check if it was registered?" Karen hesitated. The covenants don't require, "Did you contact any federal aviation authorities to verify the aircraft status?" Why would I need to do that? Agent Chen made note. So you authorized the removal of a $50,000 aircraft without verifying ownership, registration status, or legal standing. The number hit Karen like a physical blow. $50,000. That's the appraised value, yes. A 1952 Cessna. 170 in restoration condition. Agent Chen consulted her notes. Which brings us to an interesting question about your HOA's relationship with Kowalski Towing. Karen's mouth went dry. She'd hoped this line of questioning wouldn't come up. "We've reviewed your financial records, Mrs. Whitfield. Over the past 18 months, Kowalski Towing has received $43,000 in payments from your HOA for various enforcement actions. That's a significant amount for a community of 48 homes. Billy Kowalski provides competitive rates. I'm sure he does. But what's interesting is that Mr. Kowalski's business records show he pays your HOA a 15% administrative fee on all services rendered. Essentially, you're receiving kickbacks from the towing company you hire to remove residents' property." The room spun around Karen. "That's not. It's an administrative fee for processing. Mrs. Whitfield, that's a textbook kickback scheme. You create violations, authorize removals, hire your preferred contractor, and receive payments based on the revenue generated. In federal court, that's called racketeering." Karen's voice came out as a whisper. "I never meant for it to be. The intent doesn't matter. The pattern does. And when you applied this pattern to federal evidence, you crossed from civil misconduct into federal crime." Agent Torres appeared in the doorway. "Agent Chen, we found something you need to see." They moved to Karen's home office, where another agent stood beside Karen's open safe. Inside, stacks of cash sat next to a ledger book labeled HOA Special Projects. "How much cash, Agent Morrison?" $42,300. All hundreds and fifties. Agent Chen turned to Karen. "This is a lot of cash to keep at home, Mrs. Whitfield." Karen's voice barely worked. "It's savings. Savings that correspond exactly to the kickback payments you've received from Kowalski Towing over the past 18 months. The implications crashed over Karen like a tsunami. Federal agents in her home, neighbors recording everything, and now evidence of what they were calling racketeering and kickbacks. The life she'd built, HOA president, community leader, respected resident, was disintegrating in real time. "I want a lawyer," she whispered. "That's your right, but the search warrant remains valid regardless." Agent Chen's phone buzzed. She stepped away to take the call, leaving Karen standing in her violated office surrounded by federal agents. Treating her home like a crime scene, when Agent Chen returned, her expression had hardened further. "Mrs. Whitfield, that was our forensic accountant. He's been reviewing the HOA's financial records that we subpoenaed this morning." Karen's legs felt weak. "What records?" "All of them. Bank statements, vendor payments, board meeting minutes, violation records, everything. And we found some interesting patterns." Agent Chen consulted her phone. "Over the past 3 years, your HOA has collected over $200,000 in fines, late fees, and liens. But only 60% of that money can be accounted for in legitimate HOA expenses." "I don't know what you're talking about." $80,000, Mrs. Whitfield. That's how much money appears to have been diverted from the HOA's accounts into various administrative and consulting fees paid to companies that, coincidentally, list you as their registered agent. Karen felt the world collapsing around her. What had started as diligent HOA management had somehow become federal racketeering charges. The irony was suffocating. She'd spent years lecturing neighbors about rule following and community standards. And now federal agents were treating her like a common criminal. "The aircraft removal was just the trigger," Agent Chen continued. "But interference with federal evidence opened the door to examine your entire operation. What we found is a systematic pattern of using HOA authority to generate revenue through excessive enforcement, fraudulent violations, and kickback arrangements." Karen slumped into her desk chair, the same chair from which she'd written dozens of violation notices and drafted stern letters about community standards. "This is all a mistake. I was protecting property values. I was serving the community. Serving yourself isn't the same thing as serving the community. Agent Torres reappeared. Agent Chen, we are ready to transport the evidence. And the U.S. Attorney wants to speak with Mrs. Whitfield this afternoon. Transport. Karen's voice cracked. All HOA records, your computers, financial documents, and the cash from your safe. Evidence in a federal investigation. Karen watched. Federal agents carry box after box of her life's work out her front door. Through her windows, she could see neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, phones recording Eve. The federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix rose from the desert landscape like a monument to institutional power, its glass and steel facade reflecting the harsh Arizona sun. Karen Whitfield sat in the passenger seat of her attorney's BMW, staring up at the building where her fate would be decided, her hands trembling despite the morning's mild temperature. Remember what we discussed, her lawyer, David Brennan, said for the third time. Answer only what they ask. Don't volunteer information. If you're unsure about anything, look at me. Karen nodded without taking her eyes off the courthouse. 5 days had passed since the FBI raid, 5 days during which her life had unraveled with methodical precision. Her husband had returned from Denver to find their home turned upside down and his wife the subject of a federal investigation. The HOA board had held an emergency meeting to remove her as president. Neighbors who'd once deferred to her authority now crossed the street to avoid her. But nothing compared to the humiliation of walking through the courthouse lobby, past reporters who'd somehow learned about the case, their cameras capturing her. Transformation from suburban authority figure to federal defendant. The grand jury room on the 7th floor was smaller than Karen had expected, filled with 23 ordinary citizens who would decide whether she'd face federal charges. As she took the oath to tell the truth, she caught sight of a familiar face in the gallery, Marcus Reed, sitting with a woman she recognized as Agent Sarah Chen. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Gonzalez, approached the witness stand with the confident stride of someone who'd spent 15 years putting criminals behind bars. Mrs. Whitfield, please state your occupation for the record. I was the president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowner Association. Was. Karen's voice caught. I was removed from the position following recent events. Let's talk about those recent events. On July 15th, did you authorize the removal of an aircraft from Mr. Marcus Reed's property? Yes. Did you verify ownership of that aircraft before authorizing its removal? Karen glanced at her attorney, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. No. Did you contact the Federal Aviation Administration to check the aircraft's registration status? No. Did you research whether the aircraft might be connected to any ongoing or suspended federal investigations? No. Why would I? It was just sitting in his driveway. Prosecutor Gonzalez paused, letting the admission hang in the air. Mrs. Whitfield, the aircraft you ordered removed was evidence in Operation Skywatch, a federal drug investigation. By removing it, you interfered with a federal case. Did you know that obstruction of justice is a felony carrying up to 10 years in prison? Karen's attorney stood. Objection. The witness is not on trial here, and counsel is making legal arguments inappropriate for grand jury proceedings. The prosecutor smiled coldly. Withdrawn. Mrs. Whitfield, let's discuss your HOA's relationship with Kowalski Towing. For the next hour, Gonzalez methodically walked Karen through the financial arrangements that federal investigators had uncovered. The kickback payments, the excessive violation notices, the pattern of enforcement that generated revenue rather than maintained community standards. Mrs. Whitfield, in 2023, your HOA issued violation notices to 34 of your 48 residents. That's 71% of the community. Does that seem reasonable to you? We maintained high standards. Or you created violations to generate revenue. Karen's attorney objected again, but the damage was building with each question. The grand jurors, ordinary people who lived in communities like Willowbrook Estates, were beginning to see the pattern of abuse that had masqueraded as community leadership. Let's talk about Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, Gonzalez continued, consulting her notes. In March 2023, you fined her $300 for parking a commercial vehicle in her driveway. What was this commercial vehicle? Karen's throat felt dry. A catering van. Mrs. Rodriguez runs a small catering business from her home, correct? Yes. And this van, it was necessary for her business. The covenants prohibit commercial vehicles in residential driveways. Mrs. Whitfield, the van was a Honda minivan with magnetic signs advertising her catering service. Would you call that a commercial vehicle comparable to, say, a delivery truck or construction equipment? The covenants don't distinguish between types of commercial vehicles. But you have discretion in enforcement, don't you? Karen hesitated. This was dangerous territory. The board makes enforcement decisions. Actually, according to the HOA bylaws we subpoenaed, the president has broad discretionary authority over enforcement actions. You chose to fine Mrs. Rodriguez, didn't you? I followed the covenants. Gonzalez pulled out a photograph. This is Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda minivan. And this, she produced another photo, is the BMW X5 with Whitfield Insurance Services magnets that was parked in your driveway during the same time period you fined Mrs. Rodriguez. Why wasn't your vehicle considered a commercial vehicle violation? The courtroom fell silent. Karen stared at the photographs, her mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't sound like the blatant hypocrisy it obviously was. My vehicle, it's different. How is it different, Mrs. Whitfield? The circumstances were that you selectively enforced rules against residents while exempting yourself from the same standards. Isn't that correct? Karen's attorney stood again. I'm going to advise my client not to answer that question. But the grand jurors had already heard enough. Karen could see it in their faces, the recognition that they were listening to someone who'd abused a position of trust for personal gain. The questioning continued for another 40 minutes, with Gonzalez systematically destroying Karen's credibility while building a case for racketeering charges. Each financial transaction, each enforcement decision, each kickback payment was presented as part of a criminal enterprise disguised as community management. When the prosecutor finally finished, Karen felt like she'd been dissected in public. As she stepped down from the witness stand, she noticed Marcus Reed watching her with an expression that wasn't triumphant, just satisfied, like someone who'd seen justice properly served. Outside the courthouse, her attorney was blunt about their situation. Karen, they have you dead to rights on multiple federal charges. The obstruction case alone is solid, and the racketeering evidence is overwhelming. What are my options? Cooperation. Full cooperation. The prosecutors want the whole network, everyone involved in the kickback scheme, any other HOA officials who knew what was happening, financial institutions that processed questionable transactions. Karen stared at the Phoenix skyline, seeing her future crystallizing into two stark paths: cooperation that might reduce a sentence, or defiance that would likely result in decades in federal prison. There's something else, Brennan continued. Agent Chen called this morning. They've been in contact with other HOA presidents in the area. Apparently, your enforcement model has been copied by several other communities. The feds think this might be bigger than just Willowbrook Estates. The implications hit Karen like a physical blow. She wasn't just facing charges for her own actions. She was potentially the center of a region-wide corruption investigation. Her phone buzzed with a text from her husband. News trucks are at the house. I'm staying at my brother's tonight. We need to talk about the mortgage. The mortgage. In her focus on the criminal charges, Karen had forgotten about the civil consequences. The federal asset forfeiture order had frozen her bank accounts pending. The investigation's outcome. The cash seized from her safe had been deemed proceeds of criminal activity. Her house, the perfect suburban fortress from which she'd ruled Willowbrook Estates, was now at risk. That evening, Karen sat alone in her empty house, surrounded by the echoes of her former authority. The HOA files were gone, seized by federal agents. Her computer had been replaced by the FBI with a basic model that felt foreign under her fingers. Even her safe sat open and empty, a monument to her spectacular fall from grace. A knock at her door made her jump. Through the peephole, she saw Billy Kowalski standing on her porch, his usual confidence replaced by obvious anxiety. She opened the door but didn't invite him in. Karen, we got a problem, Billy said without preamble. The feds came to my lot today. They're seizing all my records, looking into every job I did for your HOA. I can't help you, Billy. Can't help me. This whole thing was your idea. You came to me with the kickback arrangement. Karen glanced around, suddenly aware that federal agents might be monitoring her communications. I don't know what you're talking about. Billy's face reddened. Don't you dare try to throw me under the bus. I got recordings, Karen. Every conversation we had about splitting the fees, about targeting specific residents, about ramping up enforcement to generate more revenue. The blood drained from Karen's face. Recordings. Insurance, Karen. I've been in business too long not to protect myself. You think I trusted some HOA president who came up with a scheme to shake down her own neighbors? After Billy left, Karen called her attorney. David, we have a problem. Billy Kowalski has recordings of our conversations. A long pause. What kind of conversations? Everything. The fee arrangement, enforcement strategies, targeting specific residents. Another pause, longer this time. Karen, I need you to understand something. If those wreck, the indictment hit Willowbrook Estates like a Category 5 hurricane. By 8 a.m., news vans lined Maple Lane, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like electronic vultures circling Karen Whitfield's Spanish-style fortress. Reporters thrust microphones at any resident brave enough to venture outside, hungry for sound bites about the HOA president who'd allegedly turned their quiet suburb into a criminal enterprise. Marcus Reed watched the media circus from his living room window, sipping coffee from a mug emblazoned with the FAA logo. His phone had been ringing since dawn, reporters wanting his side of the story, neighbors seeking details about the investigation, and old colleagues from the aviation world expressing amazement that his retirement hobby had triggered a federal racketeering case. At 9:15 a.m., his doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he saw Elena Rodriguez standing on his porch, her face etched with an expression he'd seen countless times during his federal career, the look of someone who'd finally realized they'd been victimized. Mr. Reed. I'm Elena Rodriguez. I live 3 streets over. Marcus opened the door, recognizing the name from the grand jury testimony Agent Chen had shared. The catering business. Yes. Elena's voice carried a tremor of suppressed anger. I wanted to thank you. For what? For stopping her. For making them see what she really was. Marcus gestured for Elena to come inside. She declined but continued talking, her words flowing like water through a broken dam. $300 she fined me for my van. $300 I couldn't afford, money I needed for groceries, for my daughter's school clothes. And when I couldn't pay immediately, she slapped me with late fees and threatened to put a lien on my house. Marcus had read Elena's file in the federal documents Agent Chen had shown him. Single mother, small business owner, living paycheck to paycheck while trying to build something better for her family. Exactly the kind of person Karen Whitfield had targeted because she couldn't fight back. She made me feel like a criminal, Elena continued. For 2 years, every time I parked my van in my own driveway, I felt like I was breaking the law. I started parking it 3 blocks away and walking home, just to avoid another fine. You know it wasn't legal, what she did. I know that now. The FBI agent who interviewed me, she explained how Mrs. Whitfield was using the HOA like a personal ATM machine. All those fines, all those rules, they weren't about keeping the community nice. They were about making money. Marcus watched Elena's face transform as she spoke, seeing her transition from victim to someone who understood she'd been deliberately exploited. It was a transformation he'd witnessed hundreds of times during his federal career, the moment when people realized that what they'd accepted as legitimate authority was actually criminal abuse. The worst part, Elena said, is that I believed her. When she told me I was hurting property values, when she said my business was inappropriate for a residential area, I believed her. I started to think maybe I didn't belong in Willowbrook Estates. And now, Elena's expression hardened. Now I know that she was the one who didn't belong here. After Elena left, Marcus's phone rang. Agent Sarah Chen, calling with an update that would make his day considerably more interesting. Marcus, we got the results back from the forensic analysis of your Cessna. And you were right about someone tampering with it. We found fresh fingerprints on the engine compartment panels, and they don't match you or anyone from the towing company. Marcus felt the familiar surge of investigative excitement he'd thought retirement had permanently dampened. Whose prints? That's where it gets interesting. The prints belonged to a man named Vincent Vianney Kowalski, Billy Kowalski's nephew. Let me guess, Billy didn't mention his nephew had access to the impound lot. Billy's been very cooperative since we seized his business records. Turns out the Kowalski family has been running a side business, going through impounded vehicles, looking for anything valuable. Cash, jewelry, electronics, drugs. Marcus whistled softly. How long has this been going on? Based on the financial records, at least 3 years. But here's the kicker. Vianney Kowalski served time in federal prison from 2019 to 2022 for drug trafficking. He was part of a smuggling operation that moved narcotics through Arizona. The pieces clicked together in Marcus's mind with the satisfying precision of a well-solved puzzle. The Vasquez connection. Exactly. We think Vianney might have known about the Cessna's history. When Karen had it towed, he saw an opportunity to search for whatever Tommy Vasquez might have hidden in that plane 23 years ago. Did he find anything? That's what we are trying to determine. But Marcus, there's something else. The U.S. Attorney wants to reopen the entire Operation Skywatch investigation. Your Cessna might be the key to solving a case that's been cold for over 2 decades. After hanging up, Marcus sat in his office, surrounded by the artifacts of his federal career, feeling the satisfaction of a hunter who'd flushed bigger game than he'd expected. What had started as a retirement project to restore a vintage aircraft had evolved into something far more significant: the potential resolution of one of his most frustrating unsolved cases. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. VK." Marcus stared at the message, recognizing the initials. Vianney Kowalski wanted to negotiate, which meant he'd found something in the Cessna that made him willing to risk contacting a federal investigator. Instead of responding, Marcus forwarded the message to Agent Chen and settled into wait. In his experience, criminals who wanted to talk usually had something valuable to trade, and Marcus was curious about what Vianney Kowalski thought was worth exposing himself to additional federal charges. Meanwhile, across town, Karen Whitfield sat in her attorney's office, reviewing the plea agreement that would determine whether she spent the next 5 years or the next 25 years in federal prison. "The government's offer is generous, considering the evidence against you," David Brennan said, sliding the document across his desk. 5 years in federal prison, full restitution to the HOA and affected residents, and complete cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Karen's hand shook as she read the terms. 5 years. Her daughter would graduate high school while she was in prison. Her husband would likely divorce her. He'd already moved out and retained his own attorney. The life she'd built in Willowbrook. Estates would be completely gone by the time she was released. What if I don't take the deal? Brennan's expression was grim. Based on the charges and the evidence, you're looking at a minimum of 15 years, possibly 25. Karen, they have you on tape discussing the kickback arrangements. They have financial records showing the money trail. They have testimony from dozens of residents you targeted. This isn't a case you can win at trial. But 5 years is better than 25. And the cooperation requirement means you can help reduce the sentences of other people who got caught up in this. Billy Kowalski, the board members who went along with your schemes. Karen stared out the window at downtown Phoenix, watching. Normal people go about their normal lives while hers disintegrated. The cooperation, what exactly do they want? Everything. Names, dates, financial arrangements, enforcement strategies. They want to understand how you turned an HOA into a criminal enterprise, and they want to make sure it doesn't happen again. And if I refuse, then you go to trial, and when you're convicted, and you will be convicted, you'll get the maximum sentence on every count. The judge will see you as someone who refused to take responsibility for your actions. That afternoon, Karen returned to her empty house to find a process server waiting on her porch. The papers he handed her made her remaining options crystal clear. The federal government was seizing her home as proceeds of criminal activity. She called her husband. "Tom, they're taking the house." A long pause. "I figured they would." "Karen, I've filed for divorce. My attorney says I can protect some of our assets if we separate our finances immediately." "You're abandoning me." "I'm protecting our daughter. And myself." "Karen, what you did, I never imagined you were capable of something like this." After Tom hung up, Karen sat in her living room, surrounded by the remnants of her former authority. The HOA files were gone. Her computer had been seized. Even the furniture would soon belong to the federal government, part of the asset forfeiture case that would strip away everything she'd accumulated during her years of illegal activity. Her doorbell rang again. This time, it was Agent Sarah Chen, accompanied by 2 other federal agents Karen didn't recognize. "Mrs. Whitfield, we need to discuss Vincent Kowalski." Karen's confusion must have shown on her face because Agent Chen continued without waiting for a response. "Vincent Kowalski, Billy's nephew. He had access to the impound lot where your HOA had vehicles towed. We have evidence that he tampered with Mr. Reed's aircraft while it was in storage." "I don't know anything about that." "We think you do. Vianney Kowalski has a history with drug trafficking, and the aircraft he tampered with was evidence in a federal drug case. We think he was looking for something specific, and we think he found it." Agent Chen produced a photograph of a small, wrapped package. This was hidden in a false compartment in the Cessna's fuel system. Heroin, Mrs. Whitfield. 23-year-old heroin that belonged to a drug smug. The federal courthouse's interview room smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Vincent Vianney Kowalski sat across from Agent Sarah Chen and AUSA Patricia Gonzalez, his hands trembling as he reached for his 3rd cup of coffee. In an hour. At 34, Vianney looked older than his years, prison time and methamphetamine abuse having carved premature lines into his face. "Let's start from the beginning, Vianney," Agent Chen said, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone who'd interviewed hundreds of criminals. "Tell us about Tommy Vasquez." Vianney's eyes darted between the 2 federal officers, calculating his options with the desperate mathematics of a man facing life in prison. "I need guarantees. Full immunity for the drug stuff, reduced sentence on the tampering charges." "That depends on what you give us," Gonzalez replied. "Start talking, and we'll see how valuable your information is." Vianney took a shaky breath. "Tommy was my cousin. My mom's sister's kid. He was like a big brother to me when we were growing up in Tucson." "Tell us about his operation." "Tommy wasn't just some small-time dealer. He was smart, you know? Had a whole network running drugs from Mexico up through Arizona, New Mexico, all the way to Colorado. The Cessna was just one of his planes." Agent Chen leaned forward. "One of his planes?" "Yeah, he had 3 aircraft. The Cessna, a Piper Cherokee, and this old Beechcraft. He'd rotate them, use different airstrips, different routes. Always stayed ahead of you federal guys. Until 2001. Vianney's expression darkened. Until someone snitched. Tommy got word that the feds were coming, had maybe 6 hours to disappear. But he couldn't leave without securing his insurance policy. "What insurance policy?" Gonzalez asked. "The ledger." The 2 federal officers exchanged glances. In their experience, ledgers were the holy grail of drug investigations, detailed records that could bring down entire criminal organizations. "Tell us about this ledger, Vianney." Tommy kept records of everything. Every flight, every delivery, every payment. But more than that, he kept records of who was protecting him. Agent Chen felt her pulse quicken. Protection from whom? Cops, border agents, airport officials, judges, anybody who took Tommy's money to look the other way. He called it his life insurance policy. Said if anyone ever tried to take him down, he'd take half of Arizona law enforcement with him. And this ledger was hidden in the Cessna. Vianney nodded. "Tommy called me the night before the raid. Told me if anything happened to him, I should find the plane and get the ledger. Said it was hidden in a compartment he'd built into the fuel system." Gonzalez made notes rapidly. "But you were just a kid in 2001. How old were you?" 12. Old enough to understand that my cousin was in serious trouble, but too young to do anything about it. When Tommy disappeared and the feds seized his planes, I figured the ledger was gone forever. Until Karen Whitfield had the Cessna towed. Exactly. When my Uncle Billy told me about this old plane sitting in his lot, something clicked. I mean, what are the odds? A 1952 Cessna 170 with the same tail number Tommy used to fly. Agent Chen consulted her notes. "So you broke into the aircraft while it was in the impound lot?" "I had to. 23 years I'd been wondering what happened to Tommy, whether that ledger really existed. And there it was, exactly where he said it would be. Along with 23-year-old heroin." Vianney's face flushed. That was bonus. But the ledger, that was the real treasure. Gonzalez leaned back in her chair. Vianney, we searched the aircraft thoroughly after we recovered it. We didn't find any ledger. A slow smile spread across Vianney's face. That's because I took it. Where is it now? Safe. Hidden somewhere you'll never find it without my help. Agent Chen's expression hardened. Vianney, this isn't a negotiation. You're facing federal charges for tampering with evidence, drug possession, and conspiracy. The ledger isn't your bargaining chip. It's evidence in a federal investigation. Then I guess we got ourselves a Mexican standoff, don't we? The room fell silent as the implications settled. Vianney Kowalski, a career criminal with nothing left to lose, was holding what could be the most important piece of evidence in a decades-old federal investigation. Gonzalez excused herself to make a phone call, returning 20 minutes later with an expression that suggested significant conversations had taken place. Vianney, here's what we are prepared to offer. Full immunity on the drug possession charges, reduced sentence on the tampering charges, and placement in witness protection if the ledger contains the information you claim it does. And if it doesn't, then you go to federal prison for a very long time. Vianney considered this for several minutes, his face cycling through expressions of calculation, fear, and resignation. The ledger's in a storage unit in Tempe. Unit 247 at Desert Storage on Mill Avenue. The keys taped under the sink in my apartment. 2 hours later, Agent Chen stood in a dusty storage unit, staring at a waterproof case that had been hidden behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old furniture. Inside the case, wrapped in plastic and perfectly preserved, was a leather-bound ledger that would rewrite the history of drug trafficking in the American Southwest. The ledger was everything Vianney had promised and more. Detailed flight logs, delivery schedules, payment records, and most damaging of all, a comprehensive list of law enforcement officials who had taken bribes to facilitate Tommy Vasquez's operation. Agent Chen photographed each page, her excitement building as she realized the scope of the corruption Tommy Vasquez had documented. Border Patrol agents who'd ignored specific flights, DEA officers who'd provided advance warning of raids, airport officials who'd falsified inspection records, even federal judges who'd dismissed cases in exchange for cash payments. But it was the final section of the ledger that made Agent Chen reach for her phone to call Marcus Reed. Marcus, you need to get down here immediately. What did you find? The reason Tommy Vasquez disappeared in 2001. And the reason someone's been very interested in keeping this case cold for 23 years. An hour later, Marcus Reed sat in Agent Chen's office, reading photocopies of ledger pages that made his 30-year career in federal aviation law enforcement look like a naive exercise in good intentions. Jesus Christ, Sarah. Half the people on this list were colleagues of mine. Keep reading. Marcus turned to the final pages of the ledger, where Tommy Vasquez had documented his most explosive secret. On September 10, 2001, one day before the World Trade Center attacks, Tommy had received a phone call from someone in federal law enforcement, warning him that Operation Skywatch was about to launch coordinated raids across 4 states. The caller's identity was clearly documented. Deputy Assistant Director Robert Bob Morrison, DEA Southwestern Division. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Bob Morrison was my supervisor during Operation Skywatch. He was the one who ordered me to pull back from the Vasquez investigation when other priorities emerged. Marcus, according to this ledger, Morrison had been taking payments from Tommy Vasquez for over 3 years, $50,000 per month to provide intelligence about federal investigations. The implications crashed over Marcus like a tsunami. That's why the case went cold. Morrison made sure we never had the resources to pursue Tommy Vasquez properly. It gets worse. Look at the last entry. Marcus read Tommy Vasquez's final ledger entry, dated September 11, 2001. Morrison called again. Says the 9/11 attacks changed everything. Federal priorities shifting to terrorism. Drug investigations taking back seat. Suggests I disappear permanently. Promises my protection payments bought me a clean slate if I vanish and never resurface. Agreed. Flying to Mexico tonight. Leaving planes and ledger as insurance policy. Agent Chen watched Marcus process the magnitude of the corruption that had been hidden for over 2 decades. Marcus, Bob Morrison is now Associate Deputy Director of the DEA. He's 2 promotions away from running the entire agency. Where is he now? Washington, D.C. And according to our intelligence, he has no idea we've recovered the ledger. Marcus stood and walked to Agent Chen's window, staring out at the Phoenix skyline while his mind raced through the implications. His entire career, every case he'd worked, every criminal he'd sent to prison, all of it had operated under the assumption that federal law enforcement was fundamentally honest, that corruption was the exception rather than the rule. Tommy Vasquez's ledger revealed that assumption to be catastrophically wrong. Sarah, what's the plan? We are going to bring down the entire network, starting with Morrison and working our way through every name in that ledger. How many people are we talking about? Agent Chen consulted her notes. 47 law enforcement officials across 6 states. Border Patrol, DEA, FBI, customs agents, federal prosecutors, and 3 federal judges. Marcus whistled softly. This is going to destroy careers, end marriages, topple administrations. And it all started because Karen Whitfield couldn't tolerate a vintage airplane in her neighbor's driveway. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Karen's petty authoritarianism had triggered the most significant law enforcement corruption investigation in decades. Her need to control every aspect of her suburban kingdom had accidentally exposed a criminal network that reached the highest levels of federal government. What about Karen? She's still facing her charges, but the drug trafficking